Here is Van Dieman's Rita Hayworth Locks. And as a brown, this has me thinking of a really nice sienna brown. I love it. The swatch does lie, showing it to be much more red than it comes across in the writing sample. There is no tone shift as the paper changes, and it shades really well on all papers. I am loving what I see here. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it can get deep into the page, being a little aggressive, and unfortunately, it also feathers some, or maybe a little more than some on some of the non-fountain pen friendly stuff. Now, I love the tone and shading that I get and would absolutely love the heck out of a bottle of this ink. So yes, please. I am so happy to have tried it.
The pen for today is a TWSBI Mini. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Take a look at that beautiful sienna on the page. No feather, no spread. The shading really stands out especially well with this bright white Clairfontaine paper. You have no problem in any word finding any shading, provided you open your eyes, like on provided on the first line, where the PR is certainly much darker than the OV. The I becomes a nice, darker, sort of mid-tone of I, but the dead at the end, that DED, becomes much darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Tasmania Vine Purple. Here is Van Dieman's Enchanted Woods, a shimmering ink. Here is Van Dieman's Apricot. Here is Van Dieman's Azure Kingfish, a shimmering ink.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine that does not feather, it does not spread. It does not shade nearly as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You can find some of the shading going on. You don't have to go out of your way to find it, but it is not as standout as it was on the Clairfontaine. Just take a look at proposition here on the third line, where the PR is darker than the O that lightened a whole lot. The P becomes very dark. The OSI lighter again, and now that T and then the ION, which got kind of crammed in, but the TON, I think I shortened it, becomes just slightly darker. Looking at the back of the page, you see a ton of spots where it got very, very, very deep into the paper. Now, it never touched the page underneath, but that and the minor ghosting going on would really make me hesitant about writing on both sides of the page with this ink.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does have tiny bits of feathering and only a couple of little spots, like in the arrow with the if X then Y, that if then part, the arrow, gives us a little bit, or on the not X, the not, that little mark has a little bit of feathering going on. There are a couple of spots you can see it. There is no real spread. I say no real spread because when we start to see that little bit of feathering, we see a little bit of spread with it. Shading is better than it was on the Portage, not as good as it was on the Clairfontaine. Still looks really nice here, but this, with this background, doesn't make me feel especially great about the ink. I probably wouldn't put them together. I don't feel that the tone of the ink is being altered by the tone of the paper, so I feel like this is a bit more opaque in ink. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how deep into the paper this ink always gets. Very deep into the paper, never bleeding through touching the page underneath. And I'd like to take a moment and thank the lawn crews that, it seems, for days and days are outside my window.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just about as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out well against the quad rule, which is a good thing if this is the type of paper you prefer to use. Looking at the back of the page, you can see a couple of spots that the ink did get deeper into the page, really serving as a warning sign to us about what could happen in the future. It didn't bleed through touching the page underneath. And just to add this, the lawn crews outside the window, they're not mine. I mow my own lawn. The neighbors, that their lawn people seem to be there every single day.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more brown inks. Here is Ackerman, their number 23. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Mandarin. Here is Private Reserve Sepia. Here is Zenzoy Brown. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, only slightly flatter as a tone. Really not any kind of a big deal, as it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, but doing it very well. This stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, making this a great ink to use if you're a student. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Sailor Pesh. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Green. Here is Noodler's Summer Tanager. Here is Pierre Cardin Blue. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it has tiny bits of feathering that are going on, not a huge deal, not a deal breaker on this paper. There is a tiny bit of spread going on, the tiniest bit of spread. Absolutely not a deal breaker. What a fantastic ink to use as an alternative to red if this is the type of paper that you're using and dealing with people that are sensitive to red as a correcting color or an editing color or whatever that case might be. This, I think, is a very good combination. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get regularly quite deep into the paper. While the ghosting's not too bad, it's this deeper penetration that would stop me from using the back of the page, but it might not stop you.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This TWSBI Mini has a dry fine nib and delivers a great sienna brown that delivers on the page in beauty and shading. Now, off camera, I tried this in a wet medium and it was disappointed as the tone turned more reddish like the swatch, though it still did shade. And because I like the sienna tone so much from the dry fine, that's the only way to go for me, as it has added the benefit, or it has that added benefit of the shading with that great tone.